Welcome to episode 4 of maybe we're not talking about it this day today, but what is on your workbench? So welcome today. Today I've got Chili from Allwood Solutions with me and myself, Andrew from Crafty Beetroot. And today we might briefly touch what's on our workbench, but we actually have a few other discussion points we want to talk about. So quickly, before we get into the main discussion point of today's podcast, is there anything on your workbench there, Chili?
Kind of. Let's see. I've got a saw in the vise.
Oh, a saw.
Because
okay.
Some stuff that I'm working on requires some pretty large rip cuts. And the rip cut pole saw, Japanese pole saw that I have, it's a little too short. So I picked up a saw from Harbor Freight, which is our cheap, crappy tool store. And I'm recutting and resetting the teeth to make this an actual rip saw because I'm curious if it'll work, and I'm too cheap to spend $250 on a saw.
So worthy endeavor. You have to keep us informed on how that works out, because I probably just need to sharpen my saws, but it's always, a good saw makes all the difference. I do have a nice woodworking Veritas saw.
Veritas.
I got
Nice.
one of them for doing some dovetails, but that one sits in safety over there. Well, yeah. not my everyday one grabs up there.
Yeah, it's the right tools is an important thing. And I have a great crosscut saw, Western style saw like this for crosscut, but I just don't have one for rip cuts.
Yeah.
And it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same way. My Veritas is a crosscut, and I remember when I was going to buy it, I'm like, I'll just buy one of each, and that was not going to happen. I was like, not when I was not when I was looking for like chisels and some. That was an expensive day. It was a good day. Expensive day.
Not as good as the day that they arrived on your workbench, though.
Yeah. Well, I actually was able to pick them up in person, so that was a dangerous shop to be in. That was a couple of years ago now, when I was entertaining the thought of doing dovetail joins, and then I decided a router was much easier and staples.
Yeah, all right. What about you? Is there anything on your workbench?
Yes. So as of last week's podcast, I was working on a costume, and my costume is out of the way. My wife's costume is out of the way, but the 3 children are invited too, and it's tomorrow. And we decided we're going to dress them up. It's a 90s theme, and they're all into Pokemon at the moment, so we're dressing them up as the main characters from Pokemon. And con crunch is real. I've never suffered from con crunch. I've only been to a couple cons, but I'm feeling it, because tomorrow it's all ready, and I've got a shirt that I'm taking the collar off and putting a new collar on, and taking the sleeves off, putting a different sleeves on. I've got to make a hat adjustment. I've got to make some gloves. I think I've got to make some Pokeballs in there somehow. But it's like, now it's just an order of what's the most important, what needs to be done, and it's like, get it done. And and then the youngest is going to be a Pikachu. Well, that's the idea. And so my workbench is covered in open cell foam at the moment. So
I was really hoping they were going to be your little dinosaurs.
that was our original plan, but it's a fine balance with keeps in costumes. I've learned it has to be comfortable. I mean, we can do a whole episode on costumes for kids. It's got to be they've got to want to wear it. So I've made costumes in the past that they thought they wanted to wear, but then once they started getting into it, they were like, nah, we don't want any part of this. And so you're sitting there with a bag of lollies trying to get a good photo, and it's not fun. But now that we've finished the podcast. We've talked about what's on our workbench. Good day to all. So we actually had the idea of this episode. We thought we might be a little bit light on projects, which I had another project I did this week. So I was certainly, underestimating what I had going on. But we thought it would be, we thought it would be interesting to talk about some of the common terms in the scape of making and creating and the craft world. And so we wanted to touch on some of those primary descriptive words and what they mean. What is the accepted definition of these terms in the industry, in the world, in general parlance, versus what our thoughts are, what that means, or where we think that term might be going. Language is always evolving and changing. So just because a word used to mean something doesn't mean it means that now, and doesn't mean it's going to mean it in the future. And some of these terms are quite new to me. Even the last 10 years or so, I didn't really use these words, didn't have anything to do with these words. So the first one I wanted to start off with, and we touched on this a little bit last week, and Chili's love of or original feelings towards being called this, but I wanted to talk about the term artist. And we will talk a little bit about what art is, but artist, I think, is more important. And according to Google and the Merriam-Webster dictionary, an artist is a person who creates art, such as painting, sculpture, music, writing, using conscious skills and creative imagination. So that's what it is saying an artist is. I think I'm not quite correct. What are your thoughts on that description? And I guess, what do you think? What do you call an artist, and what are those defining characteristics?
I think that artist is a very, very hard thing to define because of the essence of what is art. It can encompass a lot. I think. I kind of have my own ideas that encompass all of these terms somewhat. So we'll get to that in a bit. But in lieu of that, I'm going to share a story with you.
Okay. I like a good story.
When I first started this journey, and I quit my job and turned to doing my craft work full time, I did go to a gallery. It's really cool. It's a co-op gallery. So most galleries, like, you really have to work and sweat to get into a gallery, and then they take 70% of what your piece sells for. Like, it's a racket. So this gallery is actually a co-op, though. So it's owned and operated by the artists that are exhibiting. So I joined, and it was a very interesting experience. And I was told in no uncertain terms by a few people that I had no place there because I wasn't an artist. I was just a craftsman, which really made me mad. In fact, I got into it with one lady there who happened to be a paper mache artist. And I told her flat out, I said, honey, I have made tables that evoke more emotion than your paper mache potato over there.
Oh, no.
And I don't even remember what it was supposed to be, but it really did look like a paper mache potato. It was horrible.
Don't go down the dark path. Don't drag other artists down, Chili.
Hey, she opened the door. I just walked through it. So needless to say, I exited that scene because it it was annoying. Art is a very competitive world. Unnecessarily, it's made that way by very pretentious people who generally are not artists themselves. They're just people who want to say that they own something expensive.
Yeah. And I love the term gatekeeper. It's a term, again, I think I'll probably always mention it on this podcast. One of the main makers that's inspired me is Adam Savage, originally from Mythbusters, but he does a lot of work just on YouTube now. And he talks a lot about this gatekeeping, this, this, you cannot be part of this club because you don't have the right rules. And I think that's different to standards, and that's different to having reasons, but saying that, no, you just can't be a part of this club while not telling people how they can become part of the club, I think is a huge problem. And I mean, look at you got shot down. Now that's something that's forever gonna, anytime you think about art, you've got this blemish now in your memory of, well, I don't want to be part of that crowd. And I'm sure that we know every crowd, there's good people and there's bad people, but now it's just been tainted. And that's, I'm sorry to hear that you've had that experience, because that sounds horrible. And I guess that's why I stick to the lovely world of YouTube comments and Facebook comments, where it's always nice and happy.
Oh, nothing ever negative through those mediums. Okay. So what about, is there something in particular that you have in mind when somebody uses the term artist?
See, for me, I think artist is almost the biggest term. I mean, I think there's an element of creation. You've got to be creating something, and there's got to be some level of adjustment. So like, I wouldn't call a machinist an artist. They might produce a beautiful gear or cog or something, but they're following a very specific diagram. But a builder may be considered an artist, because a builder gets given a set of plans, but those plans are never very precise. They're always like some interpretation. And so there's always going to be a spectrum, like with most things. And I believe that line is crossed, when the person thinks they're an artist. I mean, if they consider themselves an artist and they're creating something, even if they're copying something, I'd give them the title. I mean, I think at that point, they've got this idea of what an artist is and what they want to do, and what they feel they're doing is art. And I'm definitely not somebody who can say, that's not art. But if I was, gun to my head, somebody who's following, like even a paint by numbers, right? Some people are like, that's not art. And to me, I'm like, well, if you went to recreate that piece, it would be almost impossible to recreate that piece. So this is different to, again, like a machinist or a CNC worker or a laser cutter putting something in and laser cutting a plan somebody else has given them, because there isn't that creative element. There's a making element, but there isn't that individuality that's going into that piece. And obviously some pieces, like a paper mache potato, has a lot of individualism on it, not much on the creativity or making side of it. And that's, that real high-end art where even I'm out at sea. I just don't understand, the bright red piece of painting that's, huge and upsets people. And it's like, I just don't get it. But I'm okay with that. I understand that there's a lot of things that I don't get in this world. But for me, it's that if you're creating art, and that art is something that has, like I said, it's got that element of difference to it, and you're making that change from being, I followed a plan, and either you couldn't follow the plan exactly because the plan wasn't complete, and so you had to add an element, or you had to make a decision. So for example, like following a pattern to make a dress, I feel you're an artist doing that, because you have to pick the fabric, you have to pick the pattern. If there's a pattern, you have to pick or not pick what direction that goes on. And if you go out of your way not to pick or make decisions, then you wouldn't be an artist. Like if you just walk blindly into a fabric store, picked a fabric, put your pattern on it, cut it out, sewed it together, and you didn't think consciously about changing something to make it look different, then you are losing that artistic element. But that's how I think about it. And so for something like what you do, to me, it's quite clearly art, because you're not following plans. You're coming up with an idea of a set of goals. You're picturing something in your mind, and then you're creating it. And to me, that's no different to painting a picture. And I consider a lot of what I do much less artistic, because I'm generally copying something or I'm combining things. But even in those combining, that's where my artistic element comes in. And it's, the act of laser cutting isn't really an art, but designing that laser cutter file, that's the art piece. And it's the same with, like, in my role as an engineer, I wouldn't consider really any of my engineering artistic, because it's very defined what I need to do. And I don't really get to pick which one I get to choose. I go to a table and I go, this is the safest option, this is the cheapest option. I pick that one. And so I'm missing that creative element where now sometimes there might be a situation where it doesn't matter and I'm writing up a program and I have a choice to make a diagram. And I might choose to make a diagram using certain colors. That diagram then becomes a piece of art inside of that role. So that's how I think about the artist and how they interact with those pieces. And to me, it's a very encompassing term. I mean, my kids do art, so why can't anybody do art? And there's obviously a huge scale, and if people are willing to pay money for it, then good for them. And I mean, I don't know if you're up to date within the news, but Beeple selling, $69 million non-tangible token or whatever on non-fungible token for a piece of art. I mean, I don't like the stuff, but somebody does. So he's clearly an artist. So and that's where I come at it. I think some of these other terms that we're probably going to get into are a little bit more, there are more specific guidelines. I think artist is kind of one of those loosest ones because it's not like you get a license which says, I am now a certified artist. It's definitely one of those things where if you want to call yourself that, go for it.
Well, I think that there actually are ways to get, that official title. You can go to art school.
Does that mean you're an artist though?
You can graduate. I think it's very similar to some of the other courses of study for some of these other terms. That being said, the one last thing I will say about art and artists for right now is that the coolest thing I've ever heard, and I cannot remember who said this or where I heard it, but this person said that everybody has the ability and the right to say that something is art. Nobody has the right or ability to say that something is not art.
Yeah. 100%.
Which I found that to be cool.
100% agree. Just because you don't understand it or get it, that's how does it really affect you? No. And that's 100% agree with that. So let's move on to the next term I have. And this is actually a new term for me. Well, when I say new, in the last 10 years or so, and that's this term maker. So I hadn't really heard of this term until, again, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it kind of grew out of this cosplay maker workshop, this real movement that came, I believe in, about the last 10 years. And when I was growing up, you did woodworking skills, you did metalworking skills, you did plastic, you were a sewer, you were a seamstress. There was very defined names. And then there was this term that came out of it called maker. And according to Webster Dictionary, it's a very deep meaning, this one. It's one that makes. And to me, I love it. Like, this is me 100%. Like, I love making things. I'm not interested in the artistic side of it. I'm not interested in the craft work side of it. I'm not interested in I just want to make something. And so I just figure out how to make it and I make it. And I feel like this is another very inclusive term, that if you're making something, and this is one, if you are following exactly a pattern, you're a maker. The difference with this is that an artist is making art. A maker they could be making art, but generally they're making something with intention. An artist might accidentally make art. A maker shouldn't accidentally make something, would probably be where I would differentiate those two things. But how about you? Like, I'm interested to hear your version of maker. Like, how long have you been aware of a term like that, and what are your thoughts on it?
I would say that in the last decade is really when the term maker has come to prevalence. I think it's been helped along a lot by social media platforms like YouTube and Instagram, Pinterest, those kinds of things have really kind of helped, bring up this term. And to me, I think that, prior to that term, the term that was probably most commonly used was probably hobbyist.
Yeah.
I think but what I see being the difference is that 30 years ago, it was pretty cost prohibitive to get into one, craft work. Now for the price that you would have paid to get a set of woodworking tools, you can buy a set of woodworking tools and a 3D printer and a bunch of different things, and start to play within multiple realms and multiple disciplines. And I think that's what really, to me, um, is one of the defining characteristics of a maker. Is I think that they tend to play in multiple disciplines, kind of that jack of all trades, master of none type thing.
Yeah, and I would agree 100%. I think YouTube, I think you're right. Like YouTube and Instagram is huge. I think the cosplay scene has played massively into it, because previously we thought the only way to cut a piece of wood was you had to have the correct saw. You had to use it the correct way. You could only use the correct piece of wood. You could only do that if you had a vise. And there was a correct way to do it. Not that I'm advocating for doing things the incorrect way. The cosplay scene came along and went, I've got $30. I need to make this. What have I got lying around? Let's get to town. And like just the use of foam has exploded, like EVA foam, like foam mats and things like that. And people combining that, going, well, what about if I add fabric? So then you start bringing a discipline. Then you've got, like you said, the 3D printing, the laser printer, the vinyl cutters, the CNC aspect of it. And so that combined with this group of people that they've got something they want to make, and it's not something, how do you make an Iron Man suit? Where do you even start on that, right? Like Iron Man, okay, well, I've got to know metal skills, I've got to know all this kind of stuff. And somebody goes, well, how about we just use foam, or how about we use some cardboard or paper mache or thermosetting plastics? And suddenly you get this explosion of people that are just drastically trying different things, until you get to where this maker term is just kind of like the simplest way to say, I'm a hobbyist, but I'm focused on making stuff. And yeah, I agree. A hobbyist would be the term that like my father probably would have used. And that's, yeah, this is my hobby, is doing these things.
Yeah, makers are, what I love about makers is they have a keen understanding that just because something isn't the best way doesn't mean it's the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I love that. Any craftsman who's honest will totally admit to doing that, in their career with frequency, because sometimes we don't have the best tool for the job, but we have a bevy of other tools that we can make something work. So it's I think that I have a soft spot in my heart for makers. I think that makers are amazing.
Well, and what I love is it reminds me of, when punk rock got serious and they went, oh, we should probably actually go learn how to play these instruments. Is you now see these makers that, they're just like, oh, yeah, I've just used this wood saw for cutting foam. That's fine, whatever. And then they go, well, what if I actually used it to cut wood? And then you start to see them. I mean, a perfect example is Simone Gertz. I'm probably butchering that name. I don't know if you've ever seen her. She used to have a show on YouTube. Primarily, it was on Twitter, and it was the world's crappiest robots. And so she would make like a robot for brushing her teeth, and it didn't work, right? And this is, in my mind, pure art, right? She was an artist making this beautiful, crazy art. She had a drone that would try and feed you spaghetti, and and it was basically, the concept is she would just make it, and if it worked, well, and basically the plan was for it wouldn't work. So if you get a chance, look up her portfolio. It's insane stuff. Like, she made a popcorn feeding machine that will feed you while you're watching a movie, and it just sprays popcorn everywhere. And it's very basic techniques to make this art. But if you watch her progress, now she's making beds. She cut the back off a Tesla to make it into a truck. Like, she's now delved into, she's like, I want to do it properly. I want to, I had my fun, and there's nothing wrong with that, but now I want to learn those skills. And you definitely see that with, like, another one, Adam Savage, right? During the lockdown, he used to make these elaborate props that would take him years to make, and he had some machining tools that he would use, but he was never a machinist. And now over the last year, you watch him, and he's just starting to hone in on using those tools exactly how they're supposed to be used. And so it's very fascinating watching these people transition from being a maker to being more of a craftsman, and learning those skills for the sake of learning those skills, to make the most out of the tools they have, and to just bring that finer polish on top.
Yeah, I would love to see, I mean, on the whole, I would love to see more collaboration between people who identify in these different terms. But specifically between makers and craft workers, that's a big one for me because I have laughed so hard multiple times watching some different maker videos on YouTube where they go, I've discovered this awesome way to do this. And a craftsman who has a little bit more, you know, training and tradition in how, craft work's done, looks at it and goes, yeah, I learned that a long time ago. I could have saved you a lot of time if you just asked.
If you're talking about
So,
my
I mean,
videos, Chili, you can just say it.
no. There's really been some funny ones, and it's so I'm eager to see that that change continue and grow with more collaboration between these different approaches.
Yeah, and I think YouTube is definitely what we're seeing on YouTube is these craft people that have developed these skills over 30, 40 years now are starting to get into the YouTube world. And so you see some incredible guys, like whether they're model makers or clock makers or metal workers or knife smiths. And it's just, and I love having both. I love watching these new people learn because on that learning, you're like, oh, okay, I really don't want to learn the lesson that way. That was terrible. That took them hours and weeks and don't want to do it that way. And then you watch the new guy or you watch the professional guy and go, okay, well, I don't have that tool. What are my other options? Because that's what I find is the biggest gatekeeper to craftsmen is just the tools and the materials. That's a huge limited, huge barrier to entry. But once you get that tool, your life is changed. Like when I finally got a power saw, or when I finally got a electric router, like I was like, wow, this has completely changed how I make these things. Like I can make this stuff now in half an hour instead of hours and hours and hours. So, but we've kind of danced around the term, but let's delve into probably your specialty, and that's the term craftsman. But we should probably say craftspeople, because a lot of these terms are sexist. And
yes,
I think this is definitely one because there are people like, sewers and seamstresses and all these people that are definitely craftspeople. They've just been called different names. So let's hear what well, I guess we'll go first with the description.
Yeah. What's the official word on this?
Oh, if I can, this is going to work for me. We'll just close that. A craftsman, worker who practices a trade or handicraft. Yeah, that's it. Worker who practices a trade or handicraft. So pretty fair.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, I've been trying very, very hard to use the term craft worker, because there is definitely a disparity in the craft world between genders, and it's unfortunate because there are some amazing female craft workers out there that don't get the recognition they deserve. So yeah, I agree. I try to use the term craft workers instead of craftsmen, unless I'm talking about myself personally.
My personal approach is that we should just have them as non-gendered terms. So craftsman could be man or women. And so therefore I'm quite happy to be called a seamstress, but apparently that's not catching on.
Yeah. Some people are uptight about that. Whatever. I don't care.
If I ever earn that title, I am 100% okay with it.
Well, here's my first question. Do you have another term after this that you want to discuss?
I do. Well, not really. So
okay.
I did have some other words here. I had things like master, journeyman, apprentice, and then maybe things like a smith, like a blacksmith or a knife smith.
Yep.
And then
I want to grab a marker really quick because I'm going to draw something out.
Oh, okay. Here we go. Visual aids. So there's just these words are just kind of words to throw out because I think the main words we wanted to talk about was the artist, maker, craftsman. But I think in describing those terms, some other terms will come up.
Yeah. There is actually one more
Okay.
that I kind of want to bring into this too.
Yep.
So wow, this marker really stinks. But we're gonna do a little bit of a plot here. Okay.
We've drawn an XY axis for those people that are just
yes.
listening.
So our Y axis is going to be function on the bottom side and form on the top side.
Oh, okay. Function versus form.
And our X axis is going to be tradition on the left and innovation on the right.
Just so everybody knows that can't see, Chili's writing on a piece of wood because apparently there's more wood lying around his shop than paper.
This was what was close. So that's what I grabbed.
Usually it's my workbench that's covered in all my writing. I just write it down.
That's what I do too. This is a beautiful piece of elm for those who are interested. So these are the kind of things though that I think these terms boil down to.
Okay.
So for me, I see artists being, generally more concerned with form over function and more dealing with oh wait, I put that backwards over here. More dealing with innovation than tradition.
Yep. Yeah, they're always trying to cut the edge of what's socially normal.
Yeah. Whereas craft workers, I think, are more about tradition and function. And of course, my marker is dying. And makers, I think, are about function and innovation. And this other one up here, this is a place where I would put designers.
Okay.
So they are, they're big on tradition and they're big on form.
Okay.
I think designers tend to be over here.
Yeah.
Now, these are not just 4 quadrants that describe these 4. Obviously, we as individuals live somewhere in this space and get to identify ourselves and get to, say, this is how I identify. There's some of my work that falls, way outside of what the majority of my work does, that may be more artistic. So that's where, like we talked a little bit about last week, that I acknowledge, I've had to come to terms with the fact and acknowledge that though I identify as a craftsman, I cannot deny the fact that there is an element of artistry to the things I do. So designer is one of the things that I would like to also talk about, because we do often hear about designing craft workers. That's a kind of a subset almost of craft workers. And the other one that I think is really intriguing is the term artisan.
Okay, yep. See, my understanding is artisan is kind of just another term for a crafts person. Like it's a specialist, like a specialist skill or trade.
Yeah. And I hear them used pretty interchangeably often. To me personally, this is just what pops in my head, is that generally when I think of an artisan, I think of somebody dealing more in consumable products. So like an artisan soap maker, or cheesemonger, or vintner.
Winemaker.
Like those I see as artisan trades compared to craft work trades, which I think are durable hard goods.
Yep. Or durable soft goods, like leather work or something.
Well, hard good just means tangible, long-lasting product.
Very confusing. I'm just a simple maker, Chili.
So yeah, I think those ones are really
Okay.
interesting as well.
Yeah, for me, the craftsman or craftspeople terminology is defining the skill. Is you've chosen to focus on one or two skills, and doing those skills results in making something, but you're focusing on like a craftsperson focused on woodwork. They're focusing on those woodwork skills, and because they have those woodwork skills, they make things out of woodwork. Kind of a maker's the opposite way around. They want to make something, so they have to learn those woodworking skills to make the thing, and that's all they learn. While like an example that I always think of is I was researching buttonhole making, and the tailor was talking about how he would have his apprentice learning how to make buttonholes like by hand, and basically he would count the stitches and then make them like he would count the stitches on the top, and then he'd count the stitches at the bottom and make sure they had the exact same stitches on the top and the bottom. And he was saying, oh yeah, sometimes I make them sit there and do 1,000 buttonholes until they're proficient. And to me as a maker, I'm like, what a waste of time. That's terrible. Like you get it until it's good enough and then get on to the next thing. And that to me is like a defining moment of, you as a craftsperson, you're practicing that skill for that skill to then use that skill, rather than practicing the skill enough to make just that one thing. Because as a craftsperson, my thought is you're there to deal with, I come in and ask for something, you might have never made that before, but you have the skills to make that. While me as a maker, I go, I want to make this thing, I have to find those skills or make up some skills or fudge my skills to get that result.
Yep. And that highlights really well kind of what I mean by that continuum of tradition to innovation.
Yeah.
Those skills are things that have been created and honed over centuries, many centuries, and in some cases, millennia.
Yeah.
When you look at some things like flint knapping, man, that's a prehistoric craft that some people are keeping alive, which I think is awesome. And I think the other, one of those other kind of defining things between craft workers and makers, if you ask a craft worker and a maker to do the same project, generally, and I don't mean this disparagingly.
Oh, I'm going to take
not
it
take
personally.
It that way.
I will take it personally.
but there's a difference in quality.
Oh, absolutely.
And some things do not need to be the quality that I will obsess over making it. In terms of economics, it's pretty bananas. But what I find really interesting is that work done by craft workers today will be considered art 100 years from now. If we look at things that are in museums, including art museums, there are pieces that were craft work, that were functional craft work, and there's embellishment on them, but it's all very traditional, traditional techniques that are used across the board. Not a lot of innovation in it. Like one of the things I look at and really think is looking at cars, looking at automobiles, and a Ford Focus is made by makers. A Morgan is made by craft workers. That's still, until very recently, Morgan was still using wood frames.
Yeah.
And each individual one is handcrafted as an astonishing piece, that now we look at vintage Morgans and go, God, that's a piece of art. Yeah. Old Bugattis, these old things that were made by carriage makers, one-offs, people obsess over them as art. In their day, they were craft work.
Yeah, and I think that brings definitely in the term a designer, because back then there wasn't really a designer. The craft people making that were the designers, and the client was the designer. nowadays you have a designer goes, okay, I'm going to design a Ford Focus this way. And that to me brings in like the engineer terminology, because my favorite description of an engineer is anybody can build a bridge, but an engineer can build a bridge just strong enough. So like, and that's what that designer is got that extra thing is like, okay, now we need to add in these elements. And with the craftsman versus maker, again, there's this element of, you know, if I go to you to make me a cabinet, I know you're going to make it out of wood or steel, or, you know, those two elements, because that's why I'm going to you. That's your specialty. If somebody comes to me, the first thing I'm going to ask them is, well, what do you want it made of, or what are your jobs that want it to do? Because I'm not that craftsman. I'm a maker, so I'm just worried about that final product and what its role is. So to me, I'm like, I could 3D print it if I wanted, because that's not, I don't have a horse in the race about my skills. I mean, obviously I do now because I have developed some skills, so I would play to those skills and within that. But and I think we're definitely on the same page about, you know, where these terms are. And I guess the final thing that I would want to say is, I think that there is an element of earning that craftsman title or craftspeople title. I don't think you just go, I'm a craftsperson now. I made this thing, so therefore I am now a craftsperson. I think there shouldn't be gatekeeping. There shouldn't be, no, you cannot become a craftspeople. It should be, how do I become a craftsperson? And let me show you. But there is an element of, you know, whether it's formal training or a formal apprenticeship, or just a formal training period. And even if it's, you know, I've now sold one piece in this particular scenario, so therefore I now consider myself a craftsman. I think there is an element of a standard. I guess, what are your thoughts on how should that standard be defined? And I guess, what's that standard for you, that what you had to pass to consider yourself that craftsman?
Um, I think it's somewhat similar to that quote I shared about artists. Somewhat, because I am very, very wary of gatekeeping, because that lends itself to craft work dying, not surviving and thriving. So I tend to not knock anybody for calling themselves a craft worker. Um, I know there are people who will, you know, and who would be very mad at me for calling myself a craft worker because I have not done, you know, a formal apprenticeship or something like that. To me, it's about dedication, though. That's what is really the line in the sand, to me, is that it's not something I look at this very much so like a marriage. I made a commitment to my craft. And that is, to me, what really defines a craft worker, is that level of commitment.
I'm glad I didn't make that commitment to my craft.
It's I mean, I don't know, it's interesting. And I mean, like you said, it goes back to that idea of gatekeeping. I'm always very, very wary. The last thing I ever want to do is dissuade anybody from the crafts.
Absolutely. And that's my response is always, this is how you get into it. You know, there's a million ways to get into it. And then once you're in, you realize how much you don't know. And then you realize, okay, this is, if I want to do this, this is what's involved. And it's incredible, because there are sources out there. You don't have to spend a lot of money to realize, you know, if I want to commit to this, this is the work that is involved. And I think if anybody thinks that, you know, there's no work involved in being a craftsman or craftsperson, they're wrong. Like, it is a huge amount of work. It's a huge amount of work to be a maker. And then obviously an artist as well. It just depends on your scale and commitment, and not everybody can commit every minute and every day to that task. But then it'll just take longer, and that's perfectly okay. I don't see any problem with that. It's just that we're all on a journey. And it's just kind of where we want to put ourselves on that journey. Do we want to become an artist? Do we want to become a maker? Do we want to be a craftspeople? Do we not know where we're at and just kind of working our way as we go along? And that's definitely, can you hear that? God, there are birds on our deck, and the children are not happy with said birds on the deck. So anyway, back to our serious discussion. They're persistent birds. Well, that was a great way to end the conversation. I really enjoyed this, Chili. There were some other terms that I was kind of interested to getting into, but I think we can save them for another day. But no, to me, this is a great topic, especially for the two of us, because we come at this from such a different attitude and a different background. And I really appreciate your input. And that diagram you drew was 100% correct. You know, this form versus function, tradition versus innovation. And we're always going between these. So yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you wanting to have this conversation, because I think it's an important one to be had. And it's nice to be able to have it, with somebody that I greatly respect your work, and I think that what you do as a maker is phenomenal, and I know that it's well outside of my abilities.
Most of it's outside my ability too, but don't tell anyone.
And I think that being able to have this conversation, also with a maker who does respect and understand what I do as a, it's easier to have this conversation. I think it's more productive.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, it's as long as we're always having the conversation, and we are having that conversation, that's the important thing.
Yep, I would agree. So
all right.
So yeah, I guess it's on to next week and the stuff that resides on our benches then.
Oh, there'll be something on there next week. Next week's we'll see. I'm sure there'll be something. I've got some ideas about what will be on there, but it's a long time till next week. So, all right, well, we'll catch you next week, and we'll find out what's on your workbench too. Talk to you later.